Welcome to the In-Between, where shift happens. This podcast is for anybody who has ever found themselves in that space in between what was and what's going to be. That space where life happens. The moment between where we are and where we're going. That space that is often uncomfortable to sit in. The stuff of life, the ups, the downs, the moments of connection and insight, and the moments where we can't see two steps in front of us. We will ask all the questions, maybe find some answers, and generally work at being okay in the mystery of the in-between.
In today's episode, we are going to talk about the anatomy of connection. And so in previous episodes, we talked about the lie of rugged individualism. And so I thought, man, now what, right? So we get rid of the lie of this idea of rugged individualism. And so what do we step into from that? And so what better conversation than the anatomy of connection and kind of what does that look like? What are the pieces and parts and all the little gooey centers of connection and some other questions along the way. And so the premise of this podcast is the questions and the direction of the conversation. The guest, which today is Dan, so he's not really a guest, but my personal guest here. So he has no idea about what questions I'm going to ask. So that's kind of, we're living the in-between, right?
Yeah.
Not knowing exactly what's going to happen, but stepping into that space. So the anatomy of connection, Dan. So let's get the party started. So when you think about the word connection, what are some of the pieces and parts? The pieces and parts of connection and the things that kind of push us in that direction or support this idea of connection, maybe what connection means to you personally and kind of the pieces and parts that come with that.
Yeah, wow. The pieces and parts of connection. I think there's so much to connection because there's so many different ways to connect. But the first thing that really comes up for me is just how much I've had to learn about connection in my adult life because I was, I don't know, misguided or misdirected or learned poorly or not shown at all or learned because the world told me whatever about connection as a kid.
Yeah.
And so, part of our psychological development as children is to learn, we bond with our parents, with whoever is our caretaker. And that essentially is where we learn connect, the first 3 years, the first 7 years of our life, the first 6 months of our life, that, those things we learn in that time about bonding with people, about connecting with people is how we tend to connect with people for the rest of our lives, unless we unlearn and relearn how to do it. Right. And so much of what I've learned about connection has been me unlearning things about myself to have healthier connection. And so I think, we live in a society, going back to the last episode, rugged individualism, we live in a society where connection is not actually the norm. Going it alone, learning how to be resilient and self-reliant and being able to go it alone is the value. And so we don't actually tend to push as a society those things about connection where we can actually put ourselves in relationship with other people where all of us become stronger. And so I guess that's really the big piece of connection for me is when you bring together all the people, everybody benefits, which I think is not an obvious thing in our society.
It reminds me of a potluck dinner where everyone brings something and then everyone
yeah.
Maybe it's because I'm hungry right now, but right. And so it's what is mine to bring?
Right.
And so, and then allowing people to bring what their strength is, right? I mean, I'm going to always bring the paper products because my strength is not cooking, right? And so you don't.
But somebody needs to. But somebody needs to. Yes.
And you don't want to force me to bring the pot roast because I'm never going to bring that, right? And so, I I like the idea. Connection is like a potluck dinner.
Yeah, it is. It is. And there's this I think authenticity is a huge part of connection because like in the potluck, if everybody brought salad, there's no way everybody coming to the potluck's like, yes, salad is what's mine to bring.
Right.
Right? But I've seen it happen. I've been to potlucks, like some weird potlucks before where everybody brought some like the weirdest salad they could think of and there was like nothing else. And it was like,
Or
well,
green bean casserole, like when you have 18 green bean casserole.
yeah, yeah. So, like, authenticity is, I think, a big part of connection for a lot of reasons, but, like,
Yeah.
sticking with this random metaphor of a potluck we just came up with.
Sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
No, I think it's really good, actually. Um, Bringing what is yours to authentically bring, being authentically you, showing up authentically to the place of connection, I think is actually what leads to connection, because now we all do benefit. But if we all show up the way we think we're supposed to show up, we can show up like the potluck looks like a whole potluck. And yet it's this big facade of like everybody's showing up the way they think they're supposed to show up. And all you end up with is salad or whatever, right? Like dessert. Everybody brings dessert and there's no meal. And it's like, well, that doesn't work well. But there's no way that everybody was actually called to bring dessert.
Which is kind of a weird fake connection, like, everyone
Yeah.
you I don't know, it's kind of like the oftentimes, I've read about ideas like connection, this kind of false sense of connection is like, "Oh, we all hate the same thing." So that we're all, like, connected through this sort of
Yeah.
'cause we all hate the same thing, right? Or we all, um, have reservations about the same people group, so this is connection, and that's not, right? That's not
Yeah. Yeah.
what you're describing, that's not true connection. True connection is, like, being able to come, authentically
Yes.
and allowing people to see you and you seeing others in that same respect. Otherwise, we're just seeing the Instagram version of ourselves, which is not true connection, which I think is some of the, um negative impacts necessary of like social media type stuff because we think that we're connected to folks, but we're not really. We're connected in the ways that we want people to see,
Yeah.
which I would premise is not
Yeah.
the type of connection that we're speaking.
Yeah. And I think there's a way to use social media and
Oh
internet
yeah,
and whatever to connect
absolutely.
when it's done intentionally in ways that are benefited from that kind of connection.
Yeah,
But it is not the same as like, well, I guess not all connection is built equally or designed equally or whatever, right? Like social media connection is not the same as, an intentional communal setting.
like interconnectedness. That feeling of
Yeah.
interconnectedness is a little
Yeah.
bit different than some of these kind of
Yeah.
flyby connection sort of things
Yeah.
that we speak of.
Right. Like I think a lot of what I'm seeing now, especially on TikTok and actually a lot of Instagram too. Um, I feel very connected to what's happening in Palestine. So
Mm,
there's a connection for me there, and I'm connecting to like the craziness that's happening. And I
right.
and I can see where people who aren't on these platforms, or in my mind, the people who I think are not on these platforms, are what looks to be oblivious to the genocide that's happening, right? They're like, "Oh no, this is just self-defense." They're like, "That's not fucking that's not self-defense."
Right.
Anyway, but like I think there's different types of connection, and I'm feeling more and more connected to what's going on over there, and so of course the way the algorithms work, they show you more of it, right? Um, but that feels very different than the connection that happens at a place like you know uh, a team holiday party potluck where we're all going to
Yeah,
go and have like a nice evening meal together. I mean, that's a really different type of connection.
right.
Yeah.
So I always like to talk about what gets in the way because for me that's like where the work is
Yeah.
or where the focus is. So what would you say gets in the way of connection?
Mm,
This kind of this idea, this interconnectedness, this idea of being able to connect to one another in those kind of deepest parts of
yeah.
ourselves and really build something together. What do you see gets in the way of
I
that,
think the
whether
easy
individually or collectively
yeah.
on either level?
I think the easy answer is fear.
The
But,
easy answer. It's probably
um,
the easy answer for lots of things.
yeah, and I think it is, but I think it would be we'd be remiss to stop there, to stop at
Mm,
fear. Like,
yeah.
yeah, right? And so I think fear is like the blanket answer to a lot of stuff because of all that sits beneath it. And I actually think, like, especially in the United States, there is this history of, because I have to go it alone, I need to be all the things. And if I can't show up as all of the things, then there's something wrong with me. And then I don't have a place to belong, or I'm not going to be cared for, or I'm going to be abandoned, or, that small checklist of, like, really, like, core things that keep us from connecting, really,
Mhm.
or are actually our drive for connection. And so when we heal, those things become like our greatest ability to connect. But I think we say fear because it sounds like I'm not afraid of nothing or whatever, right? Because then we're big and strong and we can do all the things. I can show up in
Right,
all the ways.
right.
Or more realistically, what happens is we learned that in society we have to have that facade of showing up in a certain way, where we look a certain way, and so many people have bought into that so strongly that, I mean, you literally have, like, entire cities and metropolitan areas with a persona built around this idea.
Mm.
Like, I've been to places, no, I mean, I seriously, I've spent time in places where, like, the facade was it. That was king. That ruled everything. And if you didn't meet the facade, if you didn't carry the facade, people were so offended, because how dare you not carry around the same facade that all of the rest of us have been forced to carry around so that we can be the thing.
Give an example. Give an example.
Um uh
Please.
yeah. So certain places in Florida, uh, um the facade is rich, thin, in shape, beach going, but you carry a really high end job. So you're working a lot. You are committed to, you add value to the world.
Mhm.
You're super important. And so if you're not really important, really thin, like to the point of, like, eating disorder thin, right?
Mm, yeah.
And a billionaire, then you don't matter. So everyone is carrying around this facade, trying to be this billionaire, trying to be this person who's really important in the world, but they're not. You're not, and I'm not, and of course, like, yeah, everyone's important, but not to the point. Like, the facade says importance is this, where
Right.
in reality, importance is, like, you matter, and in the lives of the people around you, you really matter, right? And so to show up with, like, you know with most of the jobs, like, everybody who lives there is working somewhere here, or everybody who's working here lives somewhere close enough to work here at these places. And, like, there are restaurants, there are theaters, there are movie theaters, there are fast food restaurants, there are, you know what I mean? Like, there are
Mhm.
all these places where all of these people work, and they're not making billions of dollars working at these places. So clearly we're not all the thing. So you have to dress a certain way, you have to have a certain car, you have to live in a certain place, in certain location in that city, right? Or it's like you're looked down on. And it's like,
Which it kinda
wow.
creates this little, like, bubble around you, and then I think that's kinda to your point, that's hard that gets in the way of connection, right? When everyone
Yeah.
is in
Yeah.
this homogenized sort of experience, which we know is not representative of, like, life or
Yeah.
people in
Yeah.
general,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
then it's hard to have connection when you buy into this homogenous sort of experience, and I guess I mean, you can what you just described, you can pick that up and put it in
Put
lots
it
of
anywhere.
different
Yeah.
places
Yeah.
everywhere.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think yes, I would agree that
And so the
gets in
the
the way,
fear of
and Oh, I
No, no,
also
go ahead.
think another thing that gets in the way, and maybe this is what you were gonna say, um, I think to that point too, comparison gets in the way of connection.
Yeah,
Because if I look at my life and I look at your life, and what I see is 'cause, obviously what we often see is not the whole story, right? And so then I begin to try to change and meld and form so that I can kind of fit into this experience or change my experience. Um, yeah, I think that impacts connection because I think indirectly or directly it impacts authentic expression,
yeah,
which I don't know. I think true connection, I think you have to have that authenticity, you have to have that vulnerability, you have to have, that willingness to be exposed a little bit, right?
yeah, yeah,
Because, like, if you can't see my edges, then you can't connect with them, and I think the edges of our experience is where we connect.
yeah, yeah. And so I think going back to the fear thing,
Mhm.
I think there is a fear in having to carry around that facade, that when somebody shows up who's not carrying around that facade, the fear is so strong that they literally get, like, ousted, they get, like, kicked out of town. Uh, but but on a personal level, like, I've seen people get so angry when someone else is not showing up carrying that facade, because it's like, you broke the agreement. The social agreement that to be here in this space, we've all agreed we're gonna carry around this lie. Because I think what it does is, if someone else is not carrying around the lie, it means that for someone who is carrying around that lie, they have to look at, it's either like you're the enemy and you're wrong, or I'm carrying this around for no reason. I don't really have to, even though I've bought
Yeah,
so far into, probably for their whole life, this idea that they have to be that thing. They have to like, the elite
right.
ideals and whatever, pickleball and golf and Jaguars.
Mm.
Now, there's nothing wrong with any of those things, but
Right.
when it's authentic, if you authentically love pickleball, awesome, or golf or whatever, but because it's the thing, if I do these things, then I am whatever.
I'm I I may regret going in this direction, but we're gonna go anyway, right?
Yeah,
Because
because this is the
we're
in
here.
between.
We're in the in between. We are stuck in it. We got 2 feet in. We were talking about the facade that we create and then it creates this kind of othering when
Mm,
people
yeah.
step into that experience, and then othering obviously
Mm.
is the opposite of connection. Do you think this takes place in spiritual communities too? And if so, how? I know, I know, I was like, I think we had to go there just because I think that oftentimes we talk about some of these things as if they are exist in the world and we are
But not,
immune.
yeah, right,
People on a spiritual path or in spiritual communities or any sort of, um, uh, communities where we're trying to better ourselves
yeah,
and all the things, right? It doesn't have
right.
to look like a certain spiritual community or church or whatever, but just address, are we immune to the
Immune, no.
how does it show up, I guess?
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, first, um, the fact that within spiritual communities, the conversation and the language suggests that somehow spiritual communities are separate from the rest of the world.
Mhm.
Talk about a facade.
I
We
mean,
are so different and
we've done
better
it
than we.
before we even got into the door.
Yeah, right, right, right. And I think we strive here, in like in the spiritual community we are a part of. I believe that we are at least attempting to knock down the walls of spiritual community, spiritual life separate from regular life, right? And
Right.
so we try to have like the real conversations. We try and speak in just like regular language. We're not up here like spouting the beliefs that you should believe so that you can have the life, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Because I think in and of itself, that does create a reality that is so far separated from what it's like to live in everyday life, that
Mhm.
it is an othering in and of itself. It is a separation. It is a facade of pretending that somehow I can live a life totally separate from the effects of everything else that's going on in the world around me.
Yeah.
So, uh, yeah, I mean, there's that.
Just a small thing, just a
It's
small thing.
no big deal. Um, but I think also when you set up a community with that premise, then it's the same exact thing, right? It's like we've now set up a world where you're supposed to show up in a certain way. And if you don't, you're doing it wrong because God forbid you don't pretend along with us,
Mm. Yep.
right? Like you, everyone's welcome here and you're welcome to stay here as long as you keep pretending that the world we say exists here within our own minds is actually the world you're going to walk out the doors to, and it's not in most places,
Right.
right? That's not to say that there aren't spiritual communities that have a healthier perspective on things and
Oh,
actually
yeah, I mean, there's
talk
tons of them.
to, yeah,
Yeah.
right, right, but I think the vast majority of spiritual communities that I have watched, witnessed, seen, been a part of, uh, definitely participate in that, in pretending. I mean, really, I don't have a better word for it, but it's pretending. Like we pretend that we're living in a different world than everyone else, and somehow that's so much better.
And I don't know that's the intention, right? I think it's like
Right.
this kind of
Yeah.
subconscious, but I think, we talk a lot of talk about, intention over impact, and the impact is the important piece.
Yeah.
Regardless if it's our
Yeah.
intention to
Yeah.
create this idea that you have to show up a certain way, or you're doing it wrong. I don't know that I would think very few would, intend for people to actually feel that way, I would hope.
Yeah.
But I think we do have to, like you're saying, we do have to look at the impact of our language, the impact of how we're showing up, the impact of whatever. And I think it also goes back to that fear.
Yeah.
Like, I think oftentimes for me, I wanna show up in a certain way, um, for fear that people will think I'm doing it wrong, or like, who is that person to say that they're on a spiritual path and they have this, 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 and this show up in their life, right? And which I think it's a misuse of some of the, misuse of spirituality, I think,
Yeah. Yeah.
in a lot of areas, but hmm. So we are not immune,
No,
basically is what
I
you're
think I
saying.
think we're not.
But I do think we have a
Actually, we
unique
might.
opportunity. Don't we have a unique opportunity actually to really crack open this conversation of connection? Because we have the opportunity, and when I say we, I mean any of us in whatever areas we are, whatever communities that we're in, whatever places
Yeah.
we're in, whatever groups we're in, to create spaces. It doesn't have to be a church or anything like that, but just anywhere where people are gathered, where we have a connection with groups of people. We have the opportunity to begin to unravel, or dismantle some of the fear that is associated with true connection, right? And to make authenticity and vulnerability and this
Yeah.
willingness to share of ourselves, willingness to create spaces for everyone else to do the same thing, like for that to be normal instead
Right.
of
Yeah.
instead of most of our life not being that way, and then us finding those pockets of places where we can be that. And it's like, oh yeah, I can't be that anywhere else but this place.
Yeah.
So to really, like, flip it to where, like, I can be myself everywhere else, and maybe there's, like, a tiny piece over here that I can't. Like, to really
Right.
flip the percentage on that, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. That brought up a really interesting thought because I think, and I guess this goes back to authenticity. I think if being is the premise of community, then we all think, like, I don't know, there's a quote or something about like, you're walking down the street in the city and you're so focused on how you look and what everybody is thinking about you, but like nobody's looking because they're all thinking the same thing. So if everybody
Right.
thinks everyone else is looking at them, no one's actually right.
Looking at anybody.
No one's looking at anybody. Yeah. And so I think if the premise of spiritual community is being, and this is going to sound like sacrilegious, I think. Um,
Gasp.
yeah. If the premise of spiritual community is being, then we're all training each other to think that everyone else is looking at how we are being. But everybody is
Mm,
thinking everyone else is looking at how they're being. Because we're not actually joining in community around anything. There's no content to the community. And I don't mean that to say like there's nothing in common or whatever, but like I know one of the things we've been talking about recently or implementing recently is like a community that happens because we're bringing people together to do something important or something that we deem important or that they deem important, right? You
mhm,
get a group of people together doing something that they deem important, and community happens naturally. And so that's not to say that being isn't important, but the being is what happens because you have people showing up in a space where they can be authentic. And so
yeah,
being is, the idea of being rather than doing. We're human beings, right? Like that whole thing. Um, is traditionally been really important in spiritual community. And so I could see where like, it's not about the doing. We need to pause and reflect and focus on our being. Like I get that. And I think that's important. And if we don't have any doing, what's the point? And so
right.
maybe we've also lost focus in a lot of spiritual communities on what the point is, right?
Mhm,
So if we can bring people together doing something where they can all show up authentically, then we don't have to carry a facade because we're all doing the thing together,
mm.
and being is what happens because we get to show up.
It's
And
like the
how
byproduct.
powerful yeah, how
Yeah,
powerful is that? Like bringing people together for the purpose of um, bettering the community or bettering people's lives or whatever is a powerful thing. Or even just bringing people together around a common interest
yeah.
and then being
Mhm.
together, you
It
know?
reminds me of, when I was in college on spring break, we would do, work with this organization, in the mountains, in the Appalachian Mountains, North Carolina, where we would go and we would help, people in the community with home repairs, which
Mm.
was funny because none of us knew how to do any of that. Um, and
Yeah.
actually, if I'm not mistaken, there was one spring break that we actually did more damage to the home than
Mm.
it was to begin with. I may or may not have fallen through a roof, but anyway, that's
Oh my
beside the
god.
point. This is what happens when you give power tools to people who have no idea what they're doing.
That's amazing.
But to this point, the sense of community around that, you know, it was a feeling that you couldn't really put into words. It was like
Mm.
we were all doing something, like working towards a common goal or common focus. And some of us didn't know each other closely, but at the end of that, we had something, an experience of something that was ours that we bonded over, that we connected over.
Yeah.
And then that was like the seed of connection. And then throughout the year, it was almost like going back to that connection and building a little bit a piece further, going
Yeah.
back to that piece, building a piece further. It was like this really beautiful, evolution of connection, and I think that's kind of what, um, I envision when you were talking about that. So, how do we lean into if you were to name I'm sure there are many, but 3 ways, because you did this to me on our last episode of 3 where I had to come up with, like, 3, like, practical
On
ways
the
on
spot.
the
I
spot.
knew that was gonna come back to get me.
Yeah, of course, I told you it was gonna come back to you. So, if you could set 3 ways, your top 3 ways of leaning into connection, because 'cause we've talked
Mm.
about, what makes connection, what gets in the way, some of that stuff. So 3 practical ways that we can begin to
Yeah.
lean in to this idea of building connection with one another.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think number 1 for me is one we've already talked about, and that's authenticity. I think that's a must. Without authenticity or an attempt towards authenticity,
Mhm.
right? Striving towards authenticity, I think is a must. Without that, we don't really have connection. We have fitting in, not belonging, right? Um, so authenticity is absolute number 1. And I think um, along with authenticity is finding pockets of trust. finding places where you can belong and not fit in, you know?
Mm.
And I think some of that comes along with, and maybe this is number 3, like a commitment to your personal growth, because there's a lot of stuff that, dare I say, needs to be unlearned for most of us. Like there's so much unlearning that needs to happen, and then replace that with some sort of, a healthy, holistic perception of life and connection and belonging, which I think has been around in certain ways like forever, and yet it doesn't always seem to be obvious information. And so it does all, like, I think all 3 of these things like kind of loop back on each other. Like,
Yeah.
to be authentic, you have to have personal growth. To have personal growth, you have to have the connection to healthy information so that you can unlearn and relearn, which means you have to have a place to go to. So you just kind of have to jump in, I think, right? But like
Yeah.
showing up authentically, well, you do that by doing your work, and you do your work by having a place to go to show up authentically, to belong, so that you can then learn and then have. And I think that's the tricky part, is like, how do you know what healthy beliefs do I replace those old beliefs with? And that's where I think we are seeing perhaps a return to reason and critical thinking.
Mm. Perhaps. Perhaps.
Perhaps.
All right, so wrap it up. We're gonna do this. I should have come up with a better name for this segment.
To be named in the future.
To be named in the future. All right. Final thoughts on connection. 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
Your elevator pitch on the value of connection.
Yeah.
3, 2, 1, go.
So right off the bat, the biggest thing about connection is that when we come together in authentic connection, in authentic spaces where we are all practicing our personal growth and collective learning, all of us become better than any one of us could ever become on our own. And so stepping out of this self-reliant, rugged individual mindset and fully embracing connection, despite what everything about rugged individualism has told us, despite all that, connection actually puts all of us in a better place than any one of us could ever be on our own. Boom.
You heard it here. You heard it here. That's perfect. That was the 30-second elevator speech. I don't like elevators, so it would be an escalator speech for me.
An escalator. Yeah. Yeah, why don't we have escalator speeches? Not like
maybe that's the that'll be the new segment, the 30-second escalator speech at the end.
Love it.
Well, I feel more connected, right? I think it's interesting about that, and I think that's the value of these conversations, no matter what we're talking about, is that the more that we can share our thoughts, the more we get to know one another, and not only you and I, but anyone who's listening, and by listening, you're participating in this conversation, because we are now in your brain. And so then you will take these little thoughts and then begin to like disseminate them into your experience, which
you can never unhear any of this.
Right. Whether you want to or not. So thanks for participating in this conversation of connection. It is one of many conversations, because we know that no matter what we talk about, that it is connecting. It's connecting our edges of experiences with one another. And so until next time, we will catch you in that little squidgy middle of the in-between.
Nobody really enjoys being in the in-between, but thanks for being here anyway. We may not have found all of the answers, but certainly some. And maybe more importantly, a little shift has happened. Because that is really what it's all about. Learning to be curious, authentic, and yes, maybe even a tad bit vulnerable. And the beauty of it all is that we are not alone in the in-between. So until next time, we hope a lot of shift happens.